Hello, everyone, and welcome to the discussion forum, Problem Solving in International Education and Leveraging Green Initiatives, which is the second part of our two-part series on climate action in international education. My name is EJ Brent, and I am the Senior Manager of Strategic Initiatives and Stakeholder Engagement at the BC Council for International Education, and I will be the moderator for today's session. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I live and work on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I have the honor of welcoming Elder Larry Grant back for our opening again today.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth, for that introduction. I'm Larry Grant from the Musqueam First Nation, and I'd like to say a few words of welcome in our traditional languages. Siyam te siyayat, te tholmo, kushwi te kushayat, tanaweo, sayaslap gonaskwi, tanit te Musqueam. Clark says Yomenes Kepalano, Chris Hillockstuff, the Quinar, E. McNetton, Chris E. to E. Just all stomach for Musqueam. Ste Equinas Yoenes Kepalano, sets something need to swallow E. Hillockstala. When I tennis qualawan, because I thought he Hillockstala to swallow. Say thank you to our host for having me here today, doing the land acknowledgement and welcome from the traditional ancestral unceded lands of the Hunkaminam speaking Musqueam people. And as our ancestor, our great-great-grandparent that had been here to greet the Spanish Captain Narvaez and the English Captain George Vancouver, I do today and raise my hands and welcome to all of you that are here logged on for this discussion session, ecological initiatives that we might be endeavoring to make changes in the life of all of our peoples into a more ecologically sensitive way of doing things. I come from this area, born and raised here, and the history of Vancouver is quite remarkable from the time of contact and colonization, that we live now in what I consider the largest clear-cut area in the southwest corner of the province of British Columbia, where the forest has been cut down, these magnificent monarchs of the forest that were cut down to supply timber around the world. And also all, or I should say many of the salmon-bearing streams in Metro Vancouver have been covered over or closed off or put in culverts so that they could drain the land and the land speculators can buy and sell property that is unceded. So that's one of the things that we don't really think about. In this forest, there was a huge microcosm of natural life, life-giving elements, animals, vegetation, and the animals that fly. Their homes were desecrated very much like the first peoples of this land, where there was no longer land and an ecological forest or ecological space that had the ability to maintain life. It is now covered in concrete that is bought and sold, but it's not the land, it's the concrete. So that's something that we need to keep in mind when we talk about these ecologically sensitive initiatives that we may be discussing today. So I want to say thank you again. Thank you for having me. And also to raise my hands in welcome to all of you that are here logged on to this program that is happening on the traditional, ancestral, unceded lands of the Hunt Camino speaking Musqueam people. So I raise my hands and welcome and thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Elder Larry Grant. Thank you again for starting this session for us and for starting the session earlier last week as well. I would invite everyone to take a moment to look around and acknowledge where you are, what the lands mean to you, and the territorial history of the lands you are on, given the conversation that we're going to be having. We also welcome you to share your own land acknowledgements in the chat box as well. If you don't know what lands you are on, please feel free to use nativeland.ca to find out. Thank you, Shaheen. Thank you, CJ, for sharing your land acknowledgement. Thank you, Nicole. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce and welcome our panelists in alphabetical order by given name. If you will turn on your video at this point and give a little wave. So CJ Tremblay, Manager of Marketing and IPP, Paragon Testing Enterprises. Matthew Lyle, Global Engagement Advisor at the University of British Columbia. And Shaheen Nanji, Executive Director of International at Simon Fraser University. So as we heard from Elder Larry Grant today, I am so thankful for him to have joined us today. And last week we had the privilege of having him open as well. And he shared with us about the devastating impact of climate change in Indigenous communities in BC and across Canada. This really set the stage for the conversations we're having during the series, and the stories he shared were an important reminder that this discussion is not just about climate action, but also addressing equity, local, global, through sustainability-informed international education. So instead of providing a summary of what was discussed, since many of you attended last week, I've asked each panelist to share in their own words what resonated most with them before we start our conversation today. Shaheen, we'll start with you.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks, EJ, for inviting me to be part of this panel, and thanks to everybody for coming today. So one thing that stayed with me from last week is more of a question than an insight. It's a question that I've been grappling with all week. Well, I've been grappling with it for longer than that, but it really came to light for me last week. And that's the question about the land acknowledgement itself. You know, I, like many others I know, grapple with doing land acknowledgements and how to make them authentic and intentional every time you do them. And as I listened to Elder Larry Grant last week and again today, I thought about how we talk about being settlers and our obligation to integrate Indigenous knowledge, but there's a bit of a disconnect for me, for me personally. What I don't talk enough about or think about enough is, as a settler on this unceded land, what responsibility to have truly become a caretaker and a steward of this land, and how do I use that lens in my work as I, you know, in effect, you know, I strive for development and seek to sell Canada to the rest of the world. Like, you know, it's going that extra step for me. So for me, climate action is at the core of that. So sorry, it's not a great insight, it's more of a question.
Thanks for that. And thanks everybody for having me as well. I really enjoyed the session last week, and I thought, you know, the the choice of speakers was really excellent. I think what really resonated for me is that, you know, we need to work to find depth and meaning in what's become kind of a buzzword, which is global citizenship. You know, and you know, one thing that Robin Shields said was, you know, we need to work to prepare students, and I'd argue ourselves and each other, to be, you know, transformative in the world rather than merely adapting to, you know, to it, or you know, successful in the, you know, in the framework we're working with. I mean, I think that yeah, we ultimately, you know, at the risk of sounding you know, I don't know, Pollyanna-ish or whatever, like we really do need to, you know, normalize, you know, questioning the systems we're in, and you know, asking the big questions, and having real hope in transformation. And so I think that's, and a lot of that, you know, has to do with the land, and it has to do with extraction, and the question of who benefits, right? And from all the activities that we engage in. And so incorporating, you know, a real understanding of power relations in our own work, you know, in the students' understanding of the world, I think is really essential.
For me, is sort of similar to like Shaheen, like asking yourself questions, and Matt sort of realizing, and for me too, it was very much hearing sort of Elder Larry Grant and really the impact that we have, and that sustainability, and as Jenny sort of alluded to, like sustainability is so huge, and I continue to know that to be true. And every time I have these discussions, I am sort of grounded in the fact that it's such a, sustainability is such a big piece of it, and climate action remains just a small part of sustainability, but that it is almost, that it serves as an entry point to drive immediate change, where, you know, we're not going to transform everything right away, but that we have agency to make big impact. We have access to resources and power structures that enable us to affect change on behalf of the future. And I think what Robin's research shows, and I continue to learn from him, is that it is inextricably linked. Our work is inextricably linked to the climate crisis, and that we do need to create global citizens, but how do we, and sort of, and Njoki and sort of Jenny also mentioned this, but Njoki really, I'm talking about like, we are in this new reality, and how do we transform moving forward, and how do we not lose this opportunity to change, and really look at how we can do something different and better, and as, you know, the international education industry that act as sort of the leaders and leverage that power that we do have.
Thanks, everyone. I am looking forward to this discussion where we will be questioning, and we will be seeing how we can make change happen. I would like to thank all three of you for participating in this, since this is really about sort of opening up and having a conversation and sharing and brainstorming around how we want to take action. And I also want to invite all three of you to do, as Njoki had mentioned last week, make room for imagining and dreaming differently as we meander through this path today over the course of the next hour. So the questions have been organized roughly around themes, but I am going to open up the floor at times and just let all of you interact and have conversations and question each other. The themes are roughly around partnership building, moving on to sort of marketing and recruitment, and mobility and program designs, but really take it where you see you want to go within this conversation. Because today is about a discussion. So Shaheen, I'm going to ask the first question to you, and then after I ask that question, I'm going to ask Matt and CJ to respond to your comments. The first question is, how might we begin to think about partnership development differently in the context of the climate emergency we are currently facing?
Thanks, EJ. I think that for me, it starts with talking about I think we need to start with talking about why does it matter and what kind of, how can we link this to the institutional strategies that we have? And so understanding that we have inequity, the inequity of the impact of our choices. They aren't just about the fact that we have the resources to be able to decide whether or not to take a trip. We know from COVID that the effects of climate change are being felt more strongly in countries that often pollute less, and that the effects of the pandemic are being felt more acutely by marginalized populations. But we also know that these things aren't confined to borders, and we're all in this together. So thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals and the momentum around them, it demonstrates the complexity and the immensity of the problem, and that it transcends borders and unequally impacts marginalized people. And at the very practical level, I mean, I think we have to, you know, our institutions have policies on sustainability and on climate. So we need to think strategically about how to be part of those policies. So we need to work we need to connect our work into climate action, climate responsibility, to strategies and commitments at our institutions, like our sustainability plans, to the government that has the BC Action Plan. You know, there are federal documents, similar documents and commitments, and then globally we've got the Sustainable Development Goals. In preparing for this talk, because I am by no means an expert on climate, I was talking to my colleague Candice Leroy, and I was like, where do we start with this? And she said, don't dabble at the edges. It can't just be about, let's stop faculty or students from traveling, or you know, get them to travel less. Her recommendation was work from data, set targets and strategies, and acknowledge that it's complicated. So, you know, deepening our definition of internationalization is at the core of that. So I didn't really answer the partnership question, but I wanted to get that off my chest. Why does it matter?
Yeah, I think, I mean, at UBC, we're very lucky that we have a very ambitious and effective sustainability, you know, wing at the university that, you know, they're increasing their scope in terms of, you know, what they're asking from the institution to, you know, to do in terms of tracking emissions and you know, reducing the carbon impact of all of our work. And so I think, you know, we're, in terms of our international work, like we're going to see that coming, you know, from the top down. But I mean, I don't want to wait for that for that either. And you know, I can imagine, you know, a point that we get to in all of our international partnerships where it's just sort of mainstreamed that we're looking, you know, as we're discussing any agreement, or that, you know, that we're looking at the carbon impacts of the partnership activities, of the agreement, and inputting commitments, you know, reciprocal commitments that of course that are appropriate for each party into just the regular course of our agreement work. And so again, that could look like, you know, many different things, but it needs to become sort of normalized that the climate is part of the conversation.
And that's really interesting. So I'm not in an institution. I'm sort of on the service provider side, and with my CANI hat with the Climate Action Network for International Educators, I've really just had conversations with institutions, right? So I've not been in institutions. And when it comes to partnership building, you know, we've talked about, sort of Matt alluded to just now, and I don't know the specifics, not being in an institution, but there are, you know, when we talk about like reciprocal provisions and what that looks like, it's interesting because from a partnership standpoint, there are conversations around, you know, exchanges, student exchanges, for example, where you're building a partnership and sending students, and we talk about the carbon impact of that. And you get into this situation where if we're talking about offsetting, and we're talking about the impact to an institution to pay for offsetting, and that if that's the only, there's a budget consideration there that may not, there may not be equality. And what tends to happen is when you have to pay to offset, and that's the only way, then that sort of becomes another barrier. And so then that compounds inequality and reducing the access. And so for example, I had a conversation with an institution in Jamaica who had a partnership with an organization in Canada, for an institution in Canada. Like, there is no option but to fly there. But is there at some point when we talk about, and we said this last week, like climate action is racial justice and climate justice are at the foundation of all the work that we do here. And so I'd be super keen to, from an institutional standpoint, like who holds the responsibility for paying offsets for an institution that can't maybe afford it, as institutions who are sort of more in the global north and colonizing or from in those countries. Is it our responsibility? And those are the conversations that I think need to have. It's easier in Europe where you're just going to take a train to have sort of some international experience, but there's something to be said in terms of that difficult conversation.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I mean, I think one idea that's emerged at UBC a lot from Enjo Key's work over the summer is what are we asking our partners to do, and of course it won't make sense for reciprocity to mean exactly the same, and I think I'm fortunate to be part of conversations around our partnership development for the and the internationalization plan for the university, and I think one of the issues I often try to bring up is really looking closely at the meaning of equity and reciprocity and inclusivity, and to me, an institution like UBC, steps up in that in terms of the initiative around climate action in partnerships. Another sort of area that I think there's a lot of promise is in terms of the networking that universities can do worldwide, and the ability for universities as networks also to act as conveners and to have influence over the political sphere in the world and the collective action that needs to happen. And so I think, there's a role for universities to host, to share, to share knowledge and to push again for the political climate action that needs to happen, at the global level.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we need to evolve our ideas of good partnerships beyond courting, highly ranked institutions and occasionally partnering with a less resourced institution to do some kind of capacity building. I mean, finding institutions which share our vision and go beyond rankings will make deeper collaborations that have more potential to have the kind of impact that we're talking about. But, relationships begin with people, and deep relationships require trust and shared purpose. And building those kinds of relationships are hard to do without immersing ourselves in one another's context and without meeting regularly. And, I see Daryl's comment in the chat about, doing virtual connections can happen. And we've learned a lot, and we've innovated so much over the last few months. So yeah, let's think about how can we make personal connections without always having to travel. But I don't think it's a complete solution, right? Like, we do need to understand one another's contexts. Yeah, and another thing, in the spirit of, thinking boldly, what about if we were to require some kind of environmental assessment and plan for every new international partnership, regardless of the focus of the partnership? I don't know. Sorry, I cut you off, CJ.
No, I love it. I was just going to say, I saw what Daryl said as well, and I totally agree with what you're saying. there's certainly an opportunity, and from the creativity standpoint of what we're learning now and seeing that we can build these international competencies online, really truly expanding the scope of who has access to international education by leveraging sort of that technology. And certainly not, I get that a lot. Like, are you just saying that we should never fly? Like, students should never fly? Like, no, of course not. But I think it's our duty to ensure that by partnerships or experience design, that everything is really as impactful as possible and as transformative as possible. And so I think it's doing more virtual to add to that as well.
CJ, I might actually ask you to expand on that a little bit and sort of talk about some more examples of what this looks like in practice. And I know you do a lot of marketing and recruitment and travel yourself through because of the work that you do. And so if you'd share a little bit more about that, that would be great.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously English language testing is in the beginning part of that international journey, particularly for the degree longer term programs, mobility less so, but so the experience that I have in the sector right now in the recruitment side and the earlier part of the student journey is very much is a little bit different than what we talk about, like truly expanding international access by leveraging virtual. And I think that there's certainly something to be said about that. And I think we're going to talk about that in designing experiences and student education. But I, from a recruitment and marketing standpoint, honestly, I have been floored by our ability to be effective. I think I shared last session that I emitted in 2019 11 tons of greenhouse gas carbon. My carbon footprint of just work travel was 11 tons, and it is 0 this year. And I've been able to achieve my work when I look at and I think what's really important is I have KPIs at my job, right? We all have these success metrics that we have. And I have been able to meet mine despite the fact that I've not been able to travel, and that surprised me. But it's been facilitated because of sort of the change in our conferences. I also shared that most of my travel was conference related. But I think the crux of what we have to talk about from a marketing and recruitment standpoint is the KPIs. What we measure is what drives how we do our work. And so there's a real question about are we measuring the right things? International students as revenue drivers only? How can we measure international competencies? So from my perspective, I think this is probably a good point to talk about, but specifically the conference economy, we talk about maybe going back to normal after. I've had conversations with people who want to do good and want to travel less, but if it is the case that I can only do my job and I can only go to I can only attend conferences and I have to go because they're in person, then as much agency as I have, I can't deliver on the work that I need to do. So there's something to be said for the metrics that we are using. And I'm not in an institution, so I don't have those metrics, but I've felt that tension in conversations with people who have shared what they're feeling, but also as an individual who has agency, where does the sector leadership come from? It can't all be individuals, there has to be a sector leadership. And I think conference economy might be a good thing to talk about now. I think Matt or Shaheen.
Yeah, I mean, it's been something that I've been thinking about since the first time I went to NAFSA. And you walk in, go down the escalators and you see, miles of materials and plastic crap and swag that's given out. And this strikes me as a huge, there's huge incentives, financial incentives to keep that all going. But it's also, in my mind, the kind of really low-hanging fruit that we have in terms of our work and in terms of sustainability. I mean, the last year or so, we've been clear with our partners that we're no longer producing paper materials. We prefer not to receive any more paper materials or swag. And part of the plan for this conference year was to tell our partners in advance, listen, outside of sort of some cultural protocol, we're not going to be exchanging swag. We're not going to be exchanging gifts. And my perspective is when a big university like UBC with a lot of partners does that, it starts to give some little permission to everybody to sort of say, that's, yeah, we don't really need to bring all this stuff. And I just imagine all the stuff, flying to a conference site to be exchanged by people that will either take it back, again, adding to the weight of the air travel, or leaving it in their hotel garbage. And it seems so obvious to me that there's a big room, but a big room to reduce there. But we do need to demand it. And I also, we were talking about, preparing for this, we talked about sort of, does NAFSA need to be every year? Could they alternate with, EAIE and API, in alternate years and really cut all of that in half. I think there's some good arguments for that as well. But yeah, where's the sector leadership gonna come from? I think we do need to demand it and demonstrate that there's less of a demand for sitting in a conference hall, eating hors d'oeuvres and speaking face to face with our partners.
I completely agree with what you both said. I mean, that stuff is extremely wasteful, and I think we need to think more when we do decide to take trips, because we know we can't stop traveling altogether. But when we do decide to take trips, to be more thoughtful about them. Like if you're going to a place, think about being in the region for a while and getting as much as you can done. When we have a conversation about partnerships, we sort of start a new conversation, and then I'll be visiting wherever, building a new partnership, and my parting line will be, and now you come visit us next. And that's how relationships are deepened, but maybe the next step is something different, right? Like, let's change the culture. Let's make more use of the trips that we do take, stay in the region. Don't have the mindset that, oh, I'll be back in a couple of months, I can continue this conversation then. Like, know that you're there and won't be coming back for a while. But again, just to say that, travel is just a small piece of the impact that internationalization has on climate as well.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point. And I think that it tends to be the elephant in the room in the sector. I think that having been grounded these last 9 months and almost a year, because I hadn't traveled in the first few months of the year, is what this kind of isn't time, everyone's been like reflecting and like trying to figure, like, it's just been like a time for people to reflect. And I think one of the things that has become very clear to me is that what I actually really like about this industry is developing global citizens, like contributing to, I am deeply passionate about the development of global citizens and international education and increasing access to it. And there are conversations and people sort of a little bit in the industry or who've been in it for a long time who are like, actually, like, we're an industry that everything we did was about travel. And there were people who felt deeply passionate about liking this job because it gave them the opportunity to see the world. And there wasn't a mindset necessarily. It was like the road warrior mindset. And it was about wanting to travel and wanting to be on the road. And there's people struggling with like, who am I if I'm not traveling for my work? And I think that that's a real conversation to have around, why are we in this? What is the driver as a professional that has you doing this work? And there's lots of different reasons, but probably one of them, for the sake of the planet and transforming this industry shouldn't be just because you like really like traveling and talking to people. I know that's like it's a tough one, right? And I don't know, you know, the airline status was a big deal, right? Like people like, oh, what airline status do you have? We all love getting into zone 2, right? No one wants to wait in line on the plane. Zone 2, great for boarding. But like, is that great for the planet? And is it necessary for our work?
I have so much empathy for this question of people's identity and and their job, because, and I think our work is a small example in terms of the impact. I also think of it in terms of people who work in oil and gas and coal. People's identity are really wrapped up in what we do for a living, and so I think if we're talking about global citizenship, we need to provide inspiration and options for for people to move into sectors that are sustainable. And so I wouldn't be too hard on ourselves and in this regard, but it's it's absolutely true that if this industry was moved mostly online, who would stay in it for not having the ability to travel? But it's a good question.
I mean, I do think most, right? But there are like those real conversations, and these are like kind of awkward conversations to have. But you're totally right. And like about, I didn't know how much. I was like, oh, because I used to travel all the time, and that's something that I have to reckon with. But I think about, I am surprised by how effective I'm able to do my work online, and how I'm like, there's a lot of people that I've really good, deep relationships with that I've literally never met in person. Yeah. And that is surprising to me. And also I am surprised at how passionate I feel about this industry, despite not having traveled in about a year. And so, yeah, go ahead, EJ.
No, I was going to see if anybody wanted to, Shaheen or Matt wanted to add to that. Or if, I know we talked a bit about operations as well, and kind of some of those more nitty gritty details of making these changes happen from that level. If either of you want to speak to that.
So and I've talked about this before, I have this work very much outside of my everyday job. It's not in my mandate. I don't have it in my work I don't have a carbon budget. I don't have like reduce plastic as part of my operational goals. Those aren't my operational goals. And maybe it should be. And maybe we all should have those, because you can't change what you don't measure. But also from an operational standpoint, like I do have agency. I think Matt was talking about like the disposal bins at NAFSA. When you go down there, there's like huge bins just for like recycling promotional material. And there's like so much plastic given around. So I know that there's a couple of people from my team here who have heard it from me, like, I don't want to see another single piece of plastic given out. I don't want to see anything that isn't 100% recycled or like plant paper. I don't. And so I can't, and I can sort of limit how many people need to go to a conference. But again, like I can't fully stop it. So there are things that are within my control in my role, despite the fact that I don't have KPIs related to that. But I would be keen to see sort of how we are able to determine metrics for success operationally. And that's probably for people above my pay grade to like implement them.
At UBC, not we, but the sustainability office, as I mentioned, is expanding the scope of the climate action plan for the university, which will include staff and faculty and maybe student travel. And so I was able to attend some of the discussions around, okay, what measures do we take to incorporate this, to measure these things, and And it's going to be pretty interesting to see what it looks like when departments have to track their travel. I know first class flights are going to be basically strongly discouraged or banned, and I think as public institutions there's not too many good reasons for anybody to travel first class, but we know from a carbon point of view that's one of the kind of the worst things you can do. And there's pushback. I mean, right, there's people who are not wanting that kind of oversight. So I'm glad that's happening. I think in the meantime, I also I want people to ask their finance departments and their so can I offset this? Can that be covered under the units budget? And just to start asking those questions, because I think there has to be the both bottom up and top down approaches.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no doubt that this is the time for us to be thinking about sustainability and equity in the plans and goals of our international engagement at universities or education institutions. I mean, this moment requires us to do so. Like, we're on the hook, right? We're hanging on the hook, so we've got to do something. At SFU, we're planning to use the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework for our global engagement strategy. And that'll go, that's going to go beyond responding to rankings like the impact rankings. And we have a commitment to include priorities and set internal targets measuring our own contributions to moving the needles on the various sustainable development goals. For climate action, it's it's definitely going to be a piece of it, right? Like we can't not have it be part of that. So yeah.
Thanks, Shaheen. Thanks, everyone. And sort of, I'm going to change the subject a little bit, just kind of shifting over to mobility and get your feelings a bit around. So we mentioned, we all know we're all grounded when we're having these moments where we're not flying. So what does mobility look like moving forward in all of your opinions? Matt, we'll start with you.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I work predominantly in student mobility, and so I think it's in student mobility, it's a great opportunity to reevaluate our programs from a lot of different perspectives. One is equity, availability of international learning programs to all students, and I think it's really critical that we take this time to do that. I think virtual programs are here to stay. I look forward that that this will be a sort of essential part of our work. I think going forward, along with sort of a return to mobility, but I think it's important to be cautious as well, because I think there's a few different things that can happen. I understand the climate crisis as being very connected to, capitalistic, extractive capitalism and the various mentalities that kind of go with that. And I've witnessed working in mobility, the way sometimes people talk about in student mobility is extractive in a way that, extracting experience for our students from an international location, extracting learning for our students. And I think it's important to be cautious about our mindsets and really sort of use how we operate our programs and our partnerships to model the sort of change that we want to see, and the true sort of global equity. And I guess moving back to virtual, I think also great. We want more virtual programs, because I think that they do provide a measure of equity and availability. But I also I caution that, and I think CJ referred to this as well, is just the importance of the in-person dynamic for learning for us and for students. The sort of embodied and visceral learning that happens when we're forced to encounter difference, and navigate that, and deal with the emotions and feelings that come up from that. as well as sort of just the like scheduling and the time that the way things, proceed in different parts of the world. Because when everything's scheduled on Zoom, it's on our time, and that's not really a reciprocal or equitable way of working. When when we're asking our partners to schedule things on Zoom time. And so the sort of empathy that's built up through true intercultural sort of learning, is really important to me. And I should, hospitality, hospitality rituals as well that happen when when we travel and when we're encountered with different cultures. And so all of that is a little bit lost on over Zoom. And I should say, like, the learning that happens when students go abroad is also not automatic. It doesn't happen by virtue of the students having traveled either. And so I think this echoes one of CJ's points from before, is that, if, in this new world post-COVID, with attention to the climate, if we're going to be continuing with big numbers of student mobility, attention to quality and the sort of pedagogical interventions that we do, I think is really important, so that the real learning can come from the programs the way that we believe that they should.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could also just commit to having a climate component to every mobility program that we put on, even if the program is not, the curriculum is not about climate, like just mere awareness raising of the impact of what students are about to do. I mean, obviously it could go deeper than that, but maybe that should just be a core part of our curriculum. But also just thinking about moving away from student mobility to thinking about faculty mobility, picking up on, again, Daryl made some points there about how his relationships with international partners have grown in this virtual era. And, so what can we do? How can we take advantage of this moment where everybody's virtual? And, at SFU, we've done a couple of virtual joint workshops, research workshops, and done some collaborative research. And we find that attendance is way higher because more people can participate, because it requires less of a financial commitment, less of a time commitment. They don't have to spend all that time traveling. So we're actually having more connection happening. But so what next, and how else can we use those? I think we need to continue to innovate around that. When we think about the potential of virtual collaborations to be more inclusive, though, I would just caution, I just said that more people can attend because it's not as expensive, but it's not just a financial question. There are many layers and dynamics to be creating inclusive programs. As an example, and here again, the virtual scenario that we're in right now might have some opportunity in it. But the example I'm thinking of is women who often have a hard time leaving if they have young families at home, or for a variety of cultural reasons or whatever. So it's hardest sometimes for women to travel. And they have an extra layer of considerations when they do decide to travel that are related to safety, and that include, are these the places that they can go alone, or are they going with other people? How are women treated where they're going? Like, women have this whole other layer to think about, which is somewhat removed in the virtual environment. It puts us a bit more on an equal playing field. So, there are other equity considerations as well, but I think we can't think of these issues in isolation.
And I think that sort of leads us into where we want to go with the sort of next subject, which is around empowering students, but also curriculum development. And I know we had quite a few conversations about that. So, and I know that sort of there was this call to action in the last session where we were talking about, okay, how can we set our students up to be drivers for change, and not just for the world that we're in, but for the future world that we want to create. So Matt, I'm wondering if you can speak to some of the things that UBC is doing and provide some thoughts and start this conversation there.
Sure. I mean, absolutely. And I think, we're lucky in BC, especially, youth students are drivers of change, and we need to, normalize the questions and the big that they're asking, and the big, and the big questions, because, they're onto something. Yeah, I mean, it was mentioned before. We had a wonderful student that we hired over the summer, in Joki, who is one of the speakers last week, and she did a lot of work over the summer. One of the pieces that she worked on was a pre-departure module for students that they will on climate and on sustainable travel. That they work on before they go abroad. And so we've implemented now for the group of students that will hopefully be going away in the summer or next September. And so I'm really excited about that. And she just did a wonderful job in terms of making it not about sort of this travel tips and a checklist of reducing like the impact, really kind of getting into questions of ethical engagement, and the sort of intractable nature of the climate crisis, from questions of racial and gender equity, and so we're really excited by that as sort of a starting point. I mean, the other things I'm looking at is how we can on all of our program pages have a measure of the carbon impact of a mobility program or a study abroad program, so students can, when they're shopping around for options, what to do next year, they have an understanding of the climate impact, and then from there, looking at ways we can incentivize offsetting of carbon, which is not my top priority, but I think is something that has to be done. And I'd love to see UBC, cover offsets for students. But that's a big conversation that has to happen. But I think students can also take some responsibility for those offsets. Otherwise, I'm just sort of have a collection of thoughts that I've been really inspired by a lot of reading that I've been doing, and one is on eco-pedagogy, and so this is sort of a framework that's an extension of Paulo Freire's work, the pedagogy of the oppressed. That before he passed away in the mid-90s, he was looking at the environment and realizing that he needed to add a chapter on kind of ecological pedagogy, and so other scholars have kind of taken up that work, and it's really based on the kind of a dialogical problem posing questions, asking what questions are we not asking, and really asking why certain things are the way that they are, the social and environmental violence that that happens through our activities, and problematizing that, and imagining with abandon and with hope a future, a different future, and closing the gap between where we are now and where we ought to be, and understanding, okay, what knowledge, what understanding do we need to develop to kind of get there, and what actions do we need to take. So I mean, this is a framework that I've been really inspired by lately, that I'd love to find ways to incorporate into our programming, because it really speaks to the deep kind of global citizenship that needs to be developed around a sense of common humanity, solidarity with those that are most impacted by social and environmental violence that's happening. And so I'm kind of playing and hoping that into our programming for students that are kind of engaging globally.
I totally agree. Those are great points. You know, I had on my list, do more programming that is about climate. So that's definitely a deeper look at that issue. But the other thing I would add is that we need to respond to what our students are asking for. And my sense is that they're asking us how we're going to help them become prepared for careers that will allow them to have an impact in whatever field it is they choose to work. So we need to respond to them and stay relevant in that way. And so part of that to me is that experiential and learning, experiential and immersive programming. And you know, there are ways that we're innovating there as well right now during COVID that have, you know, climate dimensions to it. As an example, SFU runs what we call the semester in dialogue, in which students work in groups on an issue of their choice that's focused on improving society, and they spend the whole semester in one group on one problem. And you know, it's carefully constructed to combine the classroom with community so that they have that place-based learning. And this spring, our semester in dialogue is going to be on wicked problems. And it's going to include international students from a couple of different countries for the first time ever. And when we first started talking about it, we were like, well, how do we do that? It's going to be too difficult. And we've got time zones, and we've got, you know, being in context and all of those things, but we're doing it. And you know, it's going to be exciting. It's a little bit of that, you know, let's broaden the definition of internationalization at home.
Yeah,
That's, oh, go ahead, Matt.
I was just gonna say, I know, absolutely. I think again, we definitely need to look at what our kind of local programs are like as well. Kind of connecting those that, you know, the goals of those that go abroad with the, you know, global source of what can be offered locally in a classroom.
Thanks, Matt. I was sent a question that I think kind of is an interesting one to throw out there. It was sent to me privately, not through the chat. So when we focus attention on minimizing the immediate emissions footprint of sudden student mobility programs, do we risk ignoring the far greater long-term emissions associated with maximizing student upward mobility as the primary goal of higher education? So just curious what your thoughts on that.
I mean, yeah, I've been thinking about that question a lot, and pardon me if I'm having some internet issues, but hopefully I'm clear. I've been thinking about that question a lot as I think, you know, we do for all of us and for our students, you know, to question our identities and our trajectory and what we value in terms of lifestyle. You know, one of the things I was thinking about, I was like, you know, we talked a lot about employability, you know, and learning that comes from like in intercultural competencies and sort of the, you know, employability outcomes that come from study abroad. And I think, you know, those are relevant and important, but, you know, do I want to see one of my students become a more effective and polite, you know, and, you know, negotiator, for example, for oil rights in Nigeria? Do I want, you know, a student, you know, learning effective intercultural competencies so that they can provide a better customer service experience for the international clientele of a cruise ship? You know, so I think that the question that the person asked is really on point, and so it's like there's the immediate things that we need to do. Yeah, we need to curb emissions yesterday, and we need to make those decisions to do that without ever losing sight of the big picture of the real, you know, problematic society and values. And so, yeah, you know, absolutely. One of the things that Paulo Freire talks about a lot is that, you know, as citizens, you know, it implies that, you know, we have agency to transform the world, you know, and ourselves, that we're unfinished, and society is unfinished, and it's with sort of hope and imagination that we can push the limits of, you know, what we can do. And so I think we can't let the small tinkering on emissions give us permission just to kind of like do the same old thing, you know. So absolutely. I mean, yeah. Thanks for that question, because it's very on point. Yeah.
So another question I have is, if we're moving to this virtual world, right? Like we're positioning so that some of these mobility and the experiences can be virtual, how sort of going back to this idea of setting, for example, students up for the job market, how are we going to position these experiences in a way that we will have employers, for example, see the same value in that experience as a travel experience, since that's what we've always been pushing and discussing before. So just some thoughts on that question.
I'm curious about that question. I'm not sure I totally understand it. Are you suggesting that employers evaluate students by having had physical international experiences? Is that something that employers look at? It's not clear to me that that is what is reviewed, but I definitely agree that the skills that come from having international experiences, and I mean physically international experiences, are hard to replace. And I going back to points that have been made already from people in the audience and from other panelists, I mean, I don't think we're suggesting stop traveling, right? Like I think it was Matt that was saying it's being more thoughtful about the curriculum and making sure that the things that we're hoping students are going to learn are we think that through very carefully and make sure that it happens, right? Or give them the best possible context in which that could happen. I don't know if I really answered that question, but I'm not sure I totally understood it.
Yeah, I think that's what the question was getting at. I'm not exactly sure. I reframed it slightly, but I think that's what it was getting at, was sort of how do we ensure that we're positioning it so that it's about learning outcomes. It's about what international education is, sort of those values that we're trying to uphold while we teach, and the learning that goes on.
That, integrating ways that students get to practice articulating their experience in writing, on a resume, in an interview, I think is really important. Because I mean, I'm not, notwithstanding my recent diatribe against the idea of employability, it is important that students are able to account for their experience and reflect on it and articulate it. And so, my dream of sort of return in-country programming and return student programming includes a lot of that. Students being able to really reflect and articulate their learning for many purposes, for their academic life and for their professional life, and obviously to transform the world.
Thanks, Matt. And just a reminder to use the Q&A for the questions, and that if you want to publish things to the whole audience, to make sure that it's going, you do the drop down to all panelists and audience members. So there's a question up here on the Q&A section that says, great points, everyone, in terms of sector leadership. So I think really going back to some of those earlier conversations, but do the panelists have thoughts on provincial, national, international groups that can convene these sorts of discussions about bigger changes to work? I might actually start with CJ and ask her to talk a bit about CANI and the work they're doing.
Yeah, Nicole, that was a great question. I'm so happy to see it. Because that's a question that I think we're all asking ourselves. And I think that that's a question that, as CANI members, even just talking about like how CANI came to be, both our founders were talking yesterday about how they were like, honestly, we just thought other people would eventually start doing this, and it didn't happen. And so here we are. We never set out to be founders of these, like founding members. And I certainly never set out to be a founding member of this organization, but I think that what Canny is doing now is trying to convene the sector, like in Europe, in Australia, Latin America, Africa, Asia. Like, we're really just trying to get as many players around the table to understand how we can, where the gaps are, both from a research standpoint, because I think that's a really important piece on like data, but we know ultimately like the vision is a net carbon zero international sector sooner rather than later. I think probably people, you might have seen, I think Wednesday, like during our session last week, the UN came out to say, you know, humans are waging a suicidal war on nature. And so we have 10 years to make change by like 45% in reduction of carbon emissions. And so like, you know, carbon emissions aren't the only thing. There's a huge, like we have to transform the system, and there's so many pieces of that. And so the Climate Action Network specifically tends to dial in specifically on reducing emissions and climate action and other parts of it as well, but that's sort of the immediate step. And so from a sector leadership standpoint, like I think Canny is hoping to organize the sector and sort of get everyone talking, but I and everyone at Canny is acutely aware that like we are not the power, the ones holding the power. You know, there's no, we can help in terms of like guide the, what is the standard benchmark for, what are the different things that you can, you know, what is the scope of what international education can impact? What is a good benchmark? Sharing those best practices. So in terms of a resource, that's certainly something that Canny is trying to do, but in terms of like driving the change, and this was asked kind of around like the timestamp, I think was kind of around when we were talking around conferences, and like that's such a good question. I don't know who is supposed, is it CBIE that should say, you know what, we're only going to have our conference every other year, and they're going to work with BCCIE to say we're going to have it on alternating years. Like I don't know the answer to that, but I think it does need to be sort of at the there's obviously like the government level, but we have our own agency as sort of members of these organizations to sort of push for that and ask those questions. And those are real. And so I tend to think that they're at the association level, and we can move those associations and push them to sort of hold our sector accountable and take that leadership standpoint. But, you know, I can't necessarily speak for them, but I think that that's kind of what we as Canny want to do, is help organize that and maybe figure out what the best solutions are. I know I just got off the virtual CBIE, which I thought was so great. I was able to do my work so effectively. I wasn't even jet lagged for a minute. And so that was like a personal bonus, but it was really from the perspective of the leadership. We all have to lead in our own way. Like there is personal agency, but I do think that we probably want, I imagine we'd want to see it at those big national levels, coordinated at an international level.
I think this speaks a lot to what I think I've been having lots of discussions with people about is around collaboration, right? So really working with partners and having conversations and all agreeing to, you know, do things together, whether it means compromising something in order to do another thing, but having that collaborative approach. I believe it was with all of you that we had that discussion where, you know, if one institution changes, there's that friction between, you know, if I don't, for example, fly, if I don't go, what if this other institution goes? And then, so I think this is really a great sort of chance for all of us to begin to have those conversations in collaboration. So having Matt and Shaheen on the same call and talking about what you can do as two big institutions in BC and how you might make certain decisions together to set an example, but also to sort of embrace and invite others to also have that conversation and make those changes as well. So I think that collaborative piece is really important as well to this conversation. I do have another question for you. And so my question is, what is one action that you plan to take now that we have had this discussion? And I'm going to open the floor up to whoever wants to start with that one. Just unmute your mic.
Well, I reached out to our sustainability office as I was preparing for this session, and I was like, what do I do? What do I say? And she, Candace, was thrilled that I'm going to be one of her warriors on climate action. So whether I want to or not, I have to act now. I mean, so my commitment, I guess, is to include a question on climate action in the development of our new international strategy. Like that has to be one of the metrics, the considerations that we put at the center, along with EDI, decolonization.
As I work on sort of our return to travel, planning for our students, I hope to integrate attention to climate and sustainability more naturally into the decision making, like I mentioned before, of our students that before they go abroad. I mean, that's a very preliminary step, but it's sort of where we're at as we're in recovery from from COVID and all that.
So from my the job that I hold every day in British Columbia, where I do my work in Canada, I think that what I sort of similar to Shaheen is like what I am committed to taking action to is sort of pushing a little bit harder on my organization to sort of account for this. And so I continue to do, and sort of as in my role, I sponsor events, and I hold purse strings when I sponsor events and exhibited events, and I hope to continue to ask those questions to the events that I will participate in, and make sure that there is a sort of long-term, just continue to push that conversation both upwards within my organization and sort of as someone who holds sponsorship dollars, sometimes having that conversation with the organizers of events. And then with my Canny hat is very much, I think, advocating for sort of standards and collaboration between countries and associations for international education on sort of leadership in this role and pushing its members further there.
Thanks for sharing. I don't see any other questions from the audience, and I might have us actually wrap up a tiny bit early so everybody can run to the washroom and do their breaks before their next meeting, since I know everybody's busy. But before we do that, we do have a poll, I believe, around sort of, what was the poll around? On confidence in climate action. Yeah, so the intersections of climate action and international education. How confident are you that you have sufficient knowledge about intersections of climate action and international education to drive change at your institution office? And we asked this at the beginning of the session last week, and we're just curious to see if the dial has moved at all. And of course, we have a really great resource on screen. I'm just gonna talk to give everybody a little bit of time to input things. We have a really great resource, CJ and Canny. So if the dial is sort of a little bit higher, but not quite, then Canny is great to a great organization to work out to, maybe. Reach out to is what I was trying to say on that one, to reach out to and get involved with. And kind of, I know she's really eager to have new participants. And let's see. I think the percentages have gone up. Wow. I've lost the document that said where we were sitting, but I believe we were at more closer to like 70% in the not at all confident and a little bit confident last week. And this week it's more like, what was that, 45, 50? 50%. So it has moved, which is really great. So I'm glad that all of you who are here felt like you learned something, that you have some takeaways and you have some action items, hopefully, and ways to kind of rethink what you've been doing and question and potentially make small changes, and that will lead to bigger changes, or at least sort of be able to start reframing some of the choices that I've made either in your office or personally. So with that being said, I really want to thank all of my presenters, CJ, Matt, Shaheen, also from last week, Jenny, Robin, and Joki. And thank you so much for just being willing to be out there and brainstorming and thinking and answering questions and being part of this discussion. This is really the catalyst of something that we need to be continuing having these discussions. This is really a starting point. I think Robin said that in his closing remarks last week. It's really about having these conversations and not being afraid to brainstorm together and to make changes and know that there are large, big picture questions, but there are also these smaller ones that we can start working on right away. So thank you for being vulnerable and being part of this conversation. I also want to say thanks to Gab and Tara Lynn for their back-end support. It's so amazing to have people who can support us with Zoom and making sure that everything's working smoothly on that end. And to Elder Larry Grant, who I think had to leave, but thank you to him for joining us for both sessions and really grounding this conversation in a place where it needs to begin. And I really look forward to having a part 2 of two-part series, maybe in the new year or at our conference, dare I say the word, where we can continue these conversations and move things forward. Now's the time to act. And so I appreciate everybody being part of this. So thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon and evening, if it's evening for you. And I look forward to chatting with you again, hopefully soon.
Bye, everyone. Thanks so much, EJ.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.